One ship crashed into a warship. Its sister ship hit an iceberg and sank. Its other sister ship hit a mine and sank too. One woman was on board for all three disasters, and she survived every single one. Her name was Violet Jessop. This is the story of Violet Jessop. The full story. Chapter 1. A childhood not meant to last. Violet Constance Jessop was born on October 2, 1887. Her family lived on a sheep farm near Bahia Blanca, Argentina. Her parents, Catherine and William Jessop, were Irish immigrants. They had left Ireland to build a new life on the Argentine plains. Violet was the oldest of 9 children. Only 6 of them would live to adulthood. As a young girl, she caught tuberculosis. Doctors told her parents she would not survive it. She proved them wrong, but the illness left her weak for years. Later in life, she said this early brush with death taught her not to fear the ones that followed. It was the first time death had reached for her. It would not be the last. When Violet was 16, her father died. He passed away from complications after a routine surgery. The family lost its main income along with him. Violet's mother moved the children back to Britain to start over. Violet was sent to a convent school there. But the family's money problems did not go away. Soon her mother's health failed as well. Violet had to leave school to help support her brothers and sisters. She was still a teenager, and already her family depended on her. In 1908, at age 21, Jessop took her first job at sea. She became a stewardess for the Royal Mail Line, working aboard a ship called the Orinoco. The pay was low and the hours were long. She worked 6 or 7 days a week, sleeping in cramped crew quarters below deck. Stewardesses cleaned cabins, made beds, and served meals to wealthy passengers who barely noticed them. Jessop did not know it yet. This small, unglamorous job would put her on a collision course with the most famous ships in history. Chapter 2. Learning the Sea. In the early 1900s, White Star Line was in a fierce rivalry with the Cunard Line. Both companies wanted control of the transatlantic passenger trade. Cunard had just built 2 record-breaking fast ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. White Star could not outrace them, so it decided to outbuild them instead. The company planned 3 enormous sister ships, each bigger and more luxurious than anything Cunard's fleet could offer. Size and comfort, not speed, would be the selling point. The first of these 3 ships was the Olympic, and Jessop was about to join its crew. A stewardess's job in the early 1900s was hard and repetitive. Jessop made beds, carried breakfast trays, and scrubbed bathrooms all day. She arranged flowers for first-class passengers who rarely learned her name. Some passengers were kind. Others treated her as if she were invisible. She watched the wealthy closely, though, and she remembered what she saw. Of one famous passenger, Madeline Astor, she later wrote that she expected a radiant beauty. Instead, she found a quiet, pale, sad-faced young woman. Jessop's memoirs are full of these sharp, quiet observations. She saw the glamour of ocean travel from the servant's side of the door. In 1911, Jessop moved to a new employer, the White Star Line. It was one of the most famous shipping companies in the world. She was assigned to its newest and grandest ship, the RMS Olympic. At the time, the Olympic was the largest ocean liner ever built. It had 2 sister ships under construction at the same shipyard in Belfast, both nearly as large. Neither ship meant much to Jessop yet. Soon, both of them would define the rest of her life. Chapter 3. The Olympic Collision. On September 20, 1911, the Olympic was leaving the port of Southampton on a routine crossing. A British warship called HMS Hawke was sailing nearby, escorted by tugs through the crowded harbor. Without warning, the Hawke turned and collided with the Olympic's hull. The warship's bow was reinforced for ramming, built specifically to survive impacts like this one. It tore 2 holes below the Olympic's waterline, and water rushed into 2 separate compartments. Passengers panicked. Many feared the giant liner might sink right there in the harbor, in full view of the crowds on shore. The Olympic did not sink. Its watertight compartments held, and the ship limped back to port for repairs. No one died in the collision, and the incident was largely forgotten within weeks. Jessop herself barely mentioned it in her later memoirs. To her, it had just been a bad scare. She had no way of knowing what came next. Her next transfer would put her on the Olympic's brand new sister ship. Newspapers were already calling that ship unsinkable. That ship was the Titanic. Chapter 4. The night the Titanic sank. Titanic's radio operators received 7 separate ice warnings on April 14, 1912. One especially urgent warning, from a nearby ship called the Mesaba, never reached the bridge at all. Captain Edward Smith slightly changed course but never slowed the ship down. Titanic was still traveling at full speed, about 22 knots, when Lookout spotted the iceberg dead ahead. The ship also carried lifeboats for only about half of the roughly 2,200 people aboard. Even a perfect evacuation could not have saved everyone that night. On April 10, 1912, Jessop boarded the RMS Titanic as a stewardess. She was 24 years old. The ship was the newest and most luxurious liner in the world, and its maiden voyage was headline news everywhere. 4 days later, near midnight on April 14, the ship struck that iceberg. Jessop later wrote that she told worried passengers not to be afraid. She insisted the ship was too new and too well built to be sinking. She did not fully believe it herself until she saw the crew begin loading the lifeboats. The disaster did not affect every passenger equally. First-class passengers had the highest survival rate on board. Third-class passengers had the lowest. They were housed on the lower decks, farthest from the lifeboats. Many third-class passengers did not even learn the ship was sinking until water was already flooding their corridors. Jessop worked among first-class passengers near the boat deck. That gave her a far easier path to a lifeboat than most people sleeping below her. An officer ordered Jessop into lifeboat 16 first. He wanted frightened passengers to see a crew member board calmly, so they would believe it was safe to follow. As her lifeboat was being lowered toward the water, another officer, James Paul Moody, handed her a baby. He told her simply to look after it. Jessop wrapped the small child in a blanket and held it close through the freezing night. She had no idea whose baby it was, or where its parents had gone. Jessop watched from the lifeboat as the Titanic broke apart and sank, less than 3 hours after hitting the iceberg. Around 1,500 people died in the disaster. The next morning, the liner Carpathia arrived and pulled survivors from the lifeboats. As Jessop climbed aboard, a woman rushed toward her. She grabbed the baby from her arms and walked away without a word of thanks. Jessop never learned who the woman was, or whose child she had carried all night. Years later, she told friends that a caller on the telephone claimed to be that same baby, all grown up. Records suggest the real baby had died young, so the story could not have been true. Before we move on to the next chapter, if you're enjoying this, please like the video, follow so you don't miss future videos, and turn on notifications. Chapter 5. Back to Sea, Into the War. Jessop kept working after the Titanic sank. She did not leave the sea, even though it had nearly killed her once already. The First World War began in 1914. Jessop volunteered as a nurse with the Voluntary Aid Detachment. It was a British organization that trained civilians to care for wounded soldiers. The work was very different from serving first-class dinners. Now she cleaned wounds and changed bandages. She comforted men who had seen the worst of the fighting on the Western Front. In 1915, the White Star Line's newest ship joined the war effort. It was the HMHS Britannic, the third and largest sister ship in the Titanic's class. Instead of carrying wealthy tourists, it was repainted white with large red crosses and converted into a floating hospital. It sailed between Britain and the Mediterranean, carrying wounded soldiers home from the fighting at Gallipoli and other fronts. Jessop was assigned to serve as a nurse aboard this very ship, the last of the Three Sisters. Chapter 6. The Britannic goes down. After the Titanic disaster, White Star Line redesigned the third sister ship to be safer. The Britannic got a double hull along its engine and boiler rooms. 6 of its watertight bulkheads were raised much higher than on the Titanic. It also carried far more lifeboats. Some had motorized davits that could launch them even if the ship tilted badly to one side. On paper, the Britannic was the safest ocean liner ever built. In practice, one small wartime habit would undo all of it. On the morning of November 21, 1916, the Britannic was sailing through the Aegean Sea. It struck a German naval mine hidden beneath the water. The explosion tore open the hull near the bow. Nurses aboard had been leaving portholes open to air out the wards in the Mediterranean heat. As the ship tilted, water poured in through those open portholes. It flooded compartments the mine damage alone might not have doomed. Despite every safety improvement built into the ship, the Britannic sank in under an hour. That was nearly twice as fast as the Titanic. Some lifeboats were launched too early, while the ship's giant propellers were still turning in the water. 2 of them drifted too close and were pulled underwater, killing the people inside. Jessop's own boat was heading toward the same danger. She made a desperate choice and jumped into the sea to escape being pulled into the blades. The suction dragged her underwater and slammed her head against the ship's keel. She later said her brain felt like it was shaking inside a bottle of liquid. Somehow, she survived. Of the 1,066 people aboard the Britannic, 30 were killed, most of them in that propeller accident. 2 other Titanic survivors were also aboard the Britannic that day, Arthur Priest and Archie Jewell. Both lived through this sinking too. For years, Jessop believed her thick auburn hair had cushioned the blow to her head. Only much later, during a routine medical exam, did doctors learn the truth. She had actually fractured her skull that day. She had been walking around with the undiagnosed injury for years. Chapter 7. A Long Life After 3 Wrecks. Remarkably, Jessop went back to sea again. In 1920, she rejoined the White Star Line. She later worked for the Red Star Line and the Royal Mail Line as well. She even sailed 2 full trips around the world aboard the liner Belgianland. She saw places most people of her time never would. Colleagues considered her calm and steady, someone who rarely spoke about what she had survived. She had lived through a collision and 2 sinkings. Still, she kept choosing to get on the next ship, voyage after voyage. At age 36, Jessop married a steward named John James Lewis. He also worked for the White Star Line. He had served aboard the Olympic and the Majestic. The marriage did not last long. They divorced about a year later, and Jessop went back to working at sea alone, much as she always had. She kept sailing for 3 more decades. She saw changes in ship design and changes in ownership. She watched the entire rise and fall of the great transatlantic liner era. It was an era she had helped build with her own hands. Jessop finally retired in 1950, after 42 years working at sea. She settled into a 16th-century thatched cottage in Great Ashfield, Suffolk. She kept a garden and raised chickens, selling their eggs for extra income. Neighbors knew her as a quiet, private woman who rarely spoke about the 3 disasters that had defined her career. She died on May 5, 1971, of congestive heart failure, at the age of 83. By then, she had outlived nearly everyone else who remembered the Titanic's first and only voyage. Jessop wrote her own memoirs late in life. The book told the story of her extraordinary career. It was not published in full until decades after her death. In it, she described the daily routines of shipboard work. She wrote about the passengers she served, and her own memories of each disaster. The book came to be called Titanic Survivor. Few crew members lived through both the Titanic and the Britannic sinkings. Jessop's memoir is one of their only first-hand accounts. Chapter 8. Why her story still gets told. Violet Jessop's story has been retold many times since her death. The 1979 miniseries SOS Titanic featured a character based directly on her. Filmmakers researching A Night to Remember drew on survivor accounts like hers. So did James Cameron, for his 1997 film Titanic. In 2012, an Irish stage play called Iceberg, Right Ahead, put her story front and center. In 2025, a BBC series called Titanic Sinks Tonight cast an actress to play her once again. Divers have even reenacted her most famous moment. In 2006, a diving expedition explored the Britannic wreck near the Greek island of Kea. Divers reenacted Jessop's jump from the lifeboat. They filmed it near the very propellers that had nearly killed her decades before. Nearly a century after the disasters, people still ask one simple question. How does anyone survive that many times, and keep choosing to go back? Her memoirs, written in her own words, are still in print today. Jessop's story is not really about luck. Every time a ship under her failed, she chose to get on the next one. That choice is rarer than surviving a shipwreck. Most people who live through one disaster spend the rest of their life avoiding anything like it again. Jessop went back to sea for 3 more decades, ship after ship, after watching 2 of them sink under her. The newspapers called her Miss Unsinkable. But that name was never really about the ship surviving. It was about her own refusal to let the sea decide how her story ended. That is the complete story of Violet Jessop, the woman 3 ships could not keep down. If history's strangest survivors fascinate you as much as they fascinate us, subscribe for more. History always has one more secret. Follow the oddities of history, and witness the past up close.